Assalamualaikum, my name is Muza Muntasir binti Abdullah. My metric number is BB1911032. The topic of our groups is the relationship between macroeconomic policy, unemployment and inflation in Malaysia. I will present an abstract and introduction of this topic. The abstract of this topic is unemployment and inflation are two economic determinants that is indicate to the poor economic condition of a country. The aim of this study is to examine the relationship between macroeconomic policy, unemployment and inflation in Malaysia. The macroeconomic policy that can overcome unemployment and inflation is like the fiscal policy and monetary policy. This study focused on how the macroeconomic policy solved the unemployment and inflation in this country. Therefore, the main finding of this study is there are relationship between macroeconomic policy, unemployment and inflation in Malaysia. Next, about the introduction, the unemployment and inflation a major issue in this economic development of a country. Unemployment is a major concern in today's macroeconomic policy. If the unemployment rate is high, there is a waste of human resources. So, the problem of unemployment is an economic problem, and it should be addressed in the labor market. In Malaysia, inflation was higher due to a large rise in global fuel and food price. The inflation rate and unemployment rate have a negative relationship. Inflationary pressure is the negative indicator of the economic stability. The authorities need to take action to curb this issue in any economy because these two issues can give a negative impact of a country's economic growth. Therefore, understanding the connection between macroeconomic policy, unemployment and inflation is important for future economic policy in Malaysia. The Phillips curve has been known as the negative correlation between unemployment and inflation since William Phillips first identified the trade-off relationship between these two variables in 1958. Lastly, to overcome unemployment and inflation is to implement macroeconomic policy in Malaysia. It is important to investigating the truth of the relationship between unemployment and inflation because these two variables is a global phenomenon that affect the country's economy. This is also how the macroeconomic policy can overcome unemployment and inflation in Malaysia. Therefore, the result of this study shows there is the relationship between macroeconomic policy, unemployment and inflation in Malaysia. That's all from me. Thank you.
My name is Timothy Sani. I will present about literature review. For our literature review, it is based on our topic, which is the relationship between inflation, macroeconomic policy, and unemployment. Mansur Jusso, 1990, stated that inflation is a wide and ongoing phenomena of rising market prices. In addition, according to Mansur Jusso 1990, inflation happens only when there is a large and consistent price rise over a period of several quarters. It is agreed by Bernstein 1968 that inflation is described as a continuous rise in a country's general price level over time. Next, according to Fisher 1983, Sarel 1996, Khan and Said Haji 2001, claim in the report of Marlina Widianti 2010 that a high inflation rate would lead to a downturn in economic growth, affecting macroeconomics and financial uncertainty. Through this, we can conclude that a rise in market prices will lead to inflation. The results of another study on the impact of fiscal policy on economic stability have been conducted by Mansur and Sulisyo 1998. According to the study, Fiscal policy has succeeded in raising economic growth but has failed to regulate the rate of rise in consumer prices, inflation. It is supported by Ragaya 1995, Tagat 1999, where it is stated that it is plain how important fiscal policy activity in the context of public spending control is in controlling the national economy. However, Chang 2002 obtained significant results during his research in South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand, where he did not find any evidence that fiscal policy could influence economic growth. Through these sources, we can see that fiscal policy has succeeded in driving economic growth for certain countries only, but not as a whole, and it is also difficult to reduce inflation. Last but not least, Purwoka and Munir 2014 share their views on the relationship between unemployment and inflation using the Phillips curve model, which it was created by William Phillips on 1958. There are only a few indicators and contexts in which inflation will trigger unemployment or vice versa, at least in the short term. Even it depends on monetary policy of how the government respond and set up. From the model, it is consistently showing proof there is trade-off by inflation and unemployment. It also shows the importance of macroeconomic policies to economic in Malaysia.
Hello, my name is Siti Nurfatemti Shahril. Today I want to present about methodology. The methodology we use is methodology data. Both annual time series data on unemployment tell macroeconomists that while the economy experiences inflation as shown by GDP growth rate, unemployment level appear to be poor. This is because rising real GDP level indicate that demand. Therefore, more laborers are needed to keep up with a higher level of production. This chart pie shows that we can measure the unemployment rate by dividing the finger, the number of people who are unemployed, by the total number in the labor force, then multiplying by 100.
You can see this is a formula for unemployment rate and formula for inflation rate. Furthermore, policy reforms in Malaysia have focused on economic change. Prices are more determined by the market and the elimination of subsidy, as well as promoting greater competition in the market for goods and services. In addition, the government also strives to ensure that inflation in Malaysia is always under control. In 2008, rising energy price as well as inflationary pressure increased.
The methodology we use, econometric modeling. For estimates B, has stated that the magnitude of the relationship between unemployment, macroeconomic policy instrument, and also external shock. The last methodology is model specification. On above specification model in the notes as the natural logarithm, and in PT is the aggregate price as well as in M2T is the money supply of M2. In addition, in YT represent the transaction output proxy by IPI. In addition, the balance is considered to be a scattering.
My name is Sitinor Amalin Aisha binti Zahari. I want to present about the result. In this section, have three subsections using rate of chart pie, calculate of the inflation rate, and econometric model method or macroeconomic policy. So, for the first is about unemployment rate. Here, we can see the table that discusses about unemployment rate has been calculated by dividing the total unemployment by the number of people in the workforce correctly. This result can be written in an formula of unemployment rate, which are for the first is percentage out of labor that got 0.372% and the second is percentage out of labor force got 37.2%. During this table, we can see the different total of percentage out of the labor force, which is the second part, are the highest than the first part. Second, about inflation, we can see that both the CPI and deflator appear to be unchanged. Meanwhile, the consumer price index are also important by using assess change in critical spending. However, we can see the impact of monetary policy on the financial situation is also important. As we know, monetary policy requires a balance between the need support to the economy. After that, Malaysian inflation rate for 2008 increased sharply by 5.44% and declined again in the following year 2009 to 0.58%. However, the decision for the inflation rate in Malaysia is stable because the government has always taken proactive measures to maintain the inflation rate in Malaysia. Lastly, about macroeconomic policy, there are two different methods in macroeconomic policy, which are fiscal policy and monetary policy. As we know, fiscal policy is more about demand. This is because companies produce more good products such as hiring more manpower and investing in new buildings and machinery. Next, for monetary policy is more of a broad money supply. Here, we can see the econometric modeling. However, using estimated acceptable model as a representative for the data generation process using the model used below the variable. Used for in PT in M2 in YT is uses to run the road unit test to determine the time properties for each series.
Conclusion. In conclusion, macroeconomic policy are very important to solve the macroeconomic issue like unemployment and inflation in this Malaysia. First, for fiscal policy can decrease unemployment by helping to increase aggregate demand and the rate of economic growth. The government need to pursue the broad fiscal policy by making tax cuts and making increase in government spending. Therefore, when taxes are reduced, disposable income will increase at once aggregate demand will decrease and also increase in real GDP. After that, business will be generate more demand for job and in the end, unemployment decrease. Second, for monetary policy, will involve cutting interest rate. When the interest rate that are lower minimize borrowing costs, allowing people to spend or invest more. The increases aggregate demand while also increasing GDP and lowering unemployment due to a lack of demand. Fiscal policy and monetary policy also can reduce inflation. Fiscal policy entails the government raising tax and cutting spending in order to reduce aggregate demand. As a result, inflationary pressure can be reduced. Next, for monetary policy, help reduce inflation in Malaysia by demanding higher rate of interest. This rising borrowing costs and discourage spending. They lead to lower economic growth and inflation.